Hello, and joining us on this episode of the Mortgage and Protection Podcast is Paul from Henchurch Lane, here to explain how the mortgage process works for nurses. Welcome back, Paul. How's it all going?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Tessa. How are you?
Good, good. I'm very glad to hear that. Yes,
Good,
I'm
good,
well too. Thank you. So
good.
let's see if we can help some of our nurses out then on this episode. So
Yeah.
we'll start with this question, of course. How do mortgages for nurses work? Any differences within that process?
Okay, so at their core, mortgages for nurses are pretty much exactly the same as any other mortgage. So lenders are going to be looking at things like their income, affordability, credit history, and their deposit. So very similar. Where I'd say that it gets a bit more interesting for nurses is that their income can be a little bit more complex than, let's say, a standard salaried income.
Hmm.
So, as an example, a lot of nurses are going to have sort of additional income through means like overtime, bank shifts, potentially unsociable hours as well.
Hmm.
So, some lenders are going to be better at recognizing those sorts of incomes and factoring them in better than others.
Hmm.
So while there's technically no nursing mortgage product, working with the right lender is still really important and can make a big difference on the outcome for them.
Hmm. Okay, so that's something to be aware of there then, but explains it all in a nutshell. We'll go into more detail as we go along these questions. So, with all that in mind, then, just to go into a little bit more detail here, what are the eligibility criteria for nurses looking to obtain a mortgage?
So lenders are going to be typically looking at their income and employment stability. Again, what we touched on there, so their credit history is always going to be taken into account, as is their deposit size. Existing financial commitments are going to be factoring into the affordability and the property that they're buying as well. So where nurses often can have advantages in the sort of looking at the underwriting side of things is that
Hmm.
healthcare is generally going to be viewed as a stable profession. So,
Hmm.
lenders are naturally going to view that in a positive light.
Yeah, which makes sense there. So that's good news. With this next question, you've touched on this slightly already, but are there any specific lenders or institutions that offer mortgages to nurses?
No, so not exclusively for nurses. However, some lenders are going to have schemes aimed at key workers from time to time. They
Mm.
can include healthcare professionals, so like nurses, dentists, that sort of thing. In reality, the bigger advantage, as we touched on, from choosing lenders that understand, it's going to be from choosing lenders that understand those complex income structures. So
Mm.
the things like the overtime, their shift allowance, the bank stuff, agency work, all of those things are going to be really what determines what the lender's going to be best suited to.
Okay, so again, some points there to take away from the episode. Now, we know that preparation is key. So, just to follow on from that, what documentation or proof is required to apply for a mortgage as a nurse? What do we need to know
Yeah.
here?
Well, it's pretty straightforward actually, because generally, we're referring to employed nurses usually. They're typically going to be asking for pay slips, so they're usually quite easy to get your hands on nowadays.
Mm.
3 months is the standard, as it will be the same for bank statements. Their deposit proof is going to be need to be provided, and their ID, so passport, driving license, proof of address, that sort of thing.
Mm.
It can be a little bit more complicated if you get into those, shift scenarios where they do bank shifts or overtime.
Mm.
They can ask for a sort of a longer history than 3 months, where that's going to sort of demonstrate some consistency. And we've actually had it before with a nurse where they asked for a whole 12 months history. So
Right.
definitely worth having your hand on document filing when it comes to those sorts of employments.
Mm, yes. Okay. Well, there we go. There's your breakdown. Let's move on to this question next. And I'm not sure how much you can say here, but what is the typical interest rate for a mortgage as a nurse in the UK? So, again, any differences here?
Yeah, so it's key, really, this question for,
Mm.
people asking this question. It's key that they understand that nurses aren't going to get a rate purely based on their profession.
Mm.
Mortgage rates in the UK are going to be determined by the factors we've touched on, right? So the size of the deposit, whether or not you've got good credit or not, what lender you go with, and just the wider interest rate environment in general.
Mm.
So as an example, to answer that, if you had two nurses applying for a rate on the same day, they could get completely different rates depending on their financial profile, basically.
Right. Okay. So hopefully that explains that there. Let's look at this question. This is interesting. So, are there any limitations or restrictions on the type of property that can be purchased as a nurse?
So lenders are always going to assess the property that you're buying as part of their mortgage decision. So that's always going to happen.
Mm,
They're looking at things like is it standard construction? Has it got a really short leasehold on it? With sort of certain types of flats, things like that. What roof has it got on it? Because that's their security.
mm,
Um, Depending on the answers to those questions, it could require that you use maybe a more specialist lender for that sort of purchase.
mm,
But that's again regardless of the buyer's profession.
mm. Okay, there we go. Right, we're getting through these questions. Let's look at this one. And again, you've probably touched on a few of the main points already, but can you explain how income verification works for nurses applying for a mortgage? Anything else we need to know here?
Right, so we touched on the fact that they're going to be after pay slips. That's the sort of easiest way to verify their income.
Mm,
We've touched on that it gets a little bit more nuanced when you add things like their overtime, their shift allowances, their bank work. Some lenders, generally will could potentially ignore all of those incomes on top of their salary, which you can imagine would make a huge difference to the outcome. So it's really
mm.
critical for the application that a nurse is using the lender that's best suited to their income situation.
Mm. Yes, definitely. Okay. Now, three questions left. So, what challenges then or obstacles might nurses face when applying for a mortgage? What do you see?
Well, you might have guessed, the income scenario tends to be the one that rears its head,
Mm,
and the reason for that is what we said. Nurse they could earn £45,000 in total, but their basic salary might only be £30,000 of that, and the rest of it could be enhancements. So,
mm,
if you use the wrong lender there, that could be the difference between you getting the house that you want and the house that you don't. So, that's the most common thing that we come up against with nurses. It's the income scenario that's difficult. And another challenge can be the sort of agency, the bank work, these additional things.
mm.
Some lenders can view that as more short term or not sustainable. So we come across that a lot too.
Okay, yes, that question followed on quite nicely, didn't it, there? But hopefully
It
that's
did.
all clear. Okay, so people would like to know as well, is it possible for newly qualified nurses to obtain a mortgage? So, is there any differences here?
Yeah, absolutely. They can obtain a mortgage with a single payslip, and in some
Wow.
instances, if you've got a permanent contract, but you haven't even started yet, if it's got a future start date, some lenders will actually look at that if it's within inside 90 days. So it's really more so, is it permanent?
Mm.
Because if it is, that's going to give you some opportunities to get a mortgage from that point in time.
Mm. Okay, well, there we go. That explains that one. And it's also good news if we've got any newly
Yes,
qualified nurses watching this or listening to this
absolutely.
episode. Yeah, really positive there. Okay, so just lastly, then, are there any additional costs or fees associated with a mortgage that nurses should be aware of?
Yes. And again, these are going to apply to any home buyer, really. So
Mm,
if you're a nurse, same as everybody else, you're going to have a list of fees that could be chargeable, valuation fees. That depends on what product you're applying for.
mm,
Legal or conveyancing fees, so they're your solicitor costs, as well as the stamp duty. That's going to be determined by how much the property is. Mortgage product or application fees. So some lenders will charge you for a specific product,
mm,
and then broker fees as well if you're using a mortgage broker. So it's really important, especially if it is, first time buyer or they've
mm.
just qualified. It's important that you're making sure that you budget for those costs alongside your deposit as well.
Yes, and it's useful to know all these costs, isn't it, in advance so that you can budget, like you've said there.
It is.
Okay. Now, before we go, Paul, we will actually be back, won't we, with a part two? There's more questions to
We will.
cover on this, which is great. Have you got anything else to add, or should we meet back on our part two episode?
We'll get it all in on the part two, I imagine, Tessa.
Yeah. All right then. We'll catch you there. Bye.
Thank you, Tessa. Take care. Bye
You
bye.
too. Bye bye.